All right. Welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Live. All right. Today, before we get into the book, we got to talk about some serious conservative retarded shit or retarded is that I say it? Retarded conservative shit that if you bring it in my chat, I'm going to ban you because you're too fucking stupid to understand how real reality works. You might want to ban yourself from the chat because I have 100% factually based, accurate information from multiple sources proving that, yeah, rich people are funding these protesters in several places, including George Soros. Okay, this first article is rightsforcanada.ca, Canadian News / who is funding and organizing the Minnesota riots. Part of the article, the end right here, it says, in December 2023, the Solutions Project awarded $50,000 to CCR through its Fund for Frontline Power as documented in Cause IQ records and reported by Alpha News. The Solutions Project, co-founded by actor Mark Ruffalo and led by Gloria Walton, supports climate justice organizations, often emphasizing groups led by women of color, immigrants, and indigenous communities. The Tides Foundation provided at least $10,000 to CCR. Tides is a donor-advised fund that channels money to liberal causes and has funded similar Minnesota organizations, including Copal MN, which I covered in my previous video, $50,000, and Unidos MN, which I covered in my previous video. George Soros is linked to CCR through Tides via his Open Society Foundation, which he has funded with more than $32 billion. Full story at thegatewaypundit.com. 2026 /01 / who is funding organizing Minnesota riots. Okay, so that's one article. Okay, that's one retarded conservative article because all of us conservative retards don't know what we're talking about. George Soros doesn't exist. He's not Jewish. He's not a Hungarian Jew that was in the Holocaust. Didn't happen. Fake news. Fake news. Fake news. I'm just a retard conservative with reading fake news. Okay, here's the New York Post. Here's who's really behind the Minneapolis ICE resistance movement. Radical leftist groups, including one financed with $7.8 million from progressive billionaire George Soros, are behind the ICE protest in Minnesota, the Post has learned. Indivisible Twin Cities, which describes itself as a grassroots group of volunteers, has led many of the protests against ICE raids in Minnesota, where Renee Nicole Good was shot dead Wednesday after allegedly trying to mow down an ICE agent with her vehicle. Indivisible is an offshoot of the Indivisible Project in Washington, D.C., which bills itself as a movement to defeat the Trump agenda and received $7,850,000 from Soros's Open Society Foundation between 2018 and 2023, according to public records. Retard conservatives. Looks like you got to kick yourself out of your own chat because you've become a retard conservative that doesn't know what you're talking about. According to public records. What the fuck does that mean? That means fake? That means it didn't happen? I'm trying to give you the benefit of the doubt here and say maybe it's both ways, but you're like, oh, retard conservatives. Did you even type in George Soros funding protest? Did you even try that? Obviously, they're not paying all 8 million protesters or 80,000 protesters that are out there. I'm talking about the leaders of it, the organizers, the people that are organizing it. according to public records. According to public records, almost $8 million that they've donated between 2018 and 2023, according to public records. Indivisible is an offshoot of the Indivisible Project in Washington, D.C., which bills itself as a movement to defeat the Trump agenda, and has received $7 million from Soros Open Society foundations between 2018 and 2023. The controversial group was also behind the recent pro-Venezuela protest and No Kings demonstrations against the Trump administration throughout the country last year. In addition to Indivisible Twin Cities, which does not identify its leaders on the website because it's a secret and they run around pretending like they're not working for George Soros and that they're just a regular old union leader or they're just a regular old protester. Other protests include the Council on American Islamic Relations, an anti-Israel group whose Minnesota chapter executive director Jaylani Hussein has rallied against ICE at protests. A young observer killed in the line of observing, we believe in a peaceful manner. They are lying, as you hear today. They already shared lies about what took place, Hussein said, speaking into a microphone at an anti-ICE demonstration on Wednesday. Good. A sometimes poet has been described by leftist sources as a legal observer during the residential ICE action where she died. Good moved from Colorado to Minnesota last year and was an anti-ICE warrior and member of ICE Watch, a coalition of activists dedicated to disrupting ICE raids in Minnesota. Nikema Levy Armstrong, the founder of the Racial Justice Network, has also been a leader of the demonstrations. Minnesota attorney and civil rights activist is one of the people helping to organize the so-called legal observers who show up at raids throughout the city to document the federal agents' activities, according to social media posts. She also posts information about vigils, demonstrations on her social media account. Armstrong played a prominent role during the protest after George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis. When embattled Minnesota Governor Tim Walz announced that he would not be seeking re-election amid a sprawling welfare fraud in the state earlier this week, Armstrong criticized his move as a retreat. So she's like, Tim Walz is a bitch, man. You got to keep getting that welfare money for the immigrants. Okay. Other protest leaders. We're not saying every single person at the protest is getting paid by George Soros one at a time. Edwin Torres de Santiago, who heads up the Immigrant Defense Network, which describes itself as an umbrella group for more than 90 nonprofits and religious groups working to protect the rights of immigrants. Born in El Salvador, De Santiago is the first undocumented immigrant to pursue a doctorate at the University of Minnesota. Okay, so we can see there from public records that the not all of them, but somebody that's organizing protests in Minnesota received $7.8 million from George Soros. Conservative retard fake stuff, fake conservative retard stuff, fake conservative retards that don't know what they're talking about. They're just retarded. Yeah, get out of my chat. Get out of my chat. I'm gonna ban you if you say retarded conservative stuff. I'm gonna ban you. Oh wait, we got one more article first. MSN. And this article was written 13 hours ago. Minnesota anti-ICE activists get how much? Well, how much did they get? $3 $3.3 million from Soros-backed charity you've never heard of because you didn't look online and just type in George Soros fund Minnesota protest. No, instead you want to call us retards, conservative retards. You better ban yourself from the chat. Gotta ban yourself from the chat now. You gotta ban yourself from the chat because you've become a conservative retard. Are you gonna ban yourself from the chat? Hey, chat. Gotta ban myself because I've become a conservative retard. Minnesota anti-ICE activists get $3.3 million from Soros. I guess this is fake too, right? This is all fake. All three of the articles so far are fake, with even the references to the other article had multiple references to other article. All fake. All fake. Conservative retards. MSM is definitely conservative. Super hyper conservative. It's like they're to the far right of like Richard Spencer and freaking well, actually I think Ben Shapiro's probably farther right than Richard Spencer. They're farther right than Ben Shapiro. MSN. Okay, let's read the article. 16 activist groups mobilizing against immigration agents in Minnesota have one thing in common: financial support from a nonprofit backed by the George Soros family's Open Society Foundation. Conservative retard shit, right? It's conservative retard shit. Gotta ban you from the chat because you're talking about conservative retard shit. The Minneapolis-based Headwaters Foundation for Justice awarded $3,321,013 in funds and non-cash assistance since 2014 to groups that now seek to monitor immigration and customs enforcement or protest the agency, according to a Daily Caller News Foundation analysis of tax filings. So I guess you're going to say that's all fake. It's all fake. It's all fake. It's all fake. It's all fake retard conservative bullshit. Gotta ban you from the chat if you say retard conservative stuff. Activist websites and their social media posts. One related post at the Minneapolis St. Paul airport led to around 100 arrests on January 23rd. The Headwaters Foundation did not respond to multiple requests for comment from the DCNF. What we are seeing in the streets of Minneapolis and across Minnesota right now is a fight for collective liberation in real time, the foundation said in a Wednesday Instagram post announcing. What is that? What is that? I can't see. Does that say that they're getting $120,000 in new grants? Other Headwater Foundation grants from 2025 are listed on the website with unspecified dollar amounts. So no, they're definitely not getting any money from George Soros. And we can obviously tell that MSN is a conservative retards. MSN is now conservative retards. Yeah, MSN is conservative retards. And they definitely didn't donate $3.3 million. It didn't happen. Only a conservative retard would believe something like that. How could you ever believe that the anti-ICE protesters were being backed by George Soros? It doesn't even make sense. Only a retard would believe that. Only a conservative retard would believe that George Soros is backing the protesters in Minneapolis, Minnesota, the anti-ICE protesters. Only a retard, only a conservative retard. Are you going to ban yourself from the chat? Are you going to ban yourself from the chat now? That's the question. And the answer, we know the answer is no. We know the answer is no. Show this on the live stream. The answer is no. So don't believe my lying eyes right here where it says $3.3 million from George Soros. I'm going to leave this fake news story up here, so just in case, you want to question later. I mean, I already covered the Unidos MN thing in a previous video about like a week ago, saying that they were organizing the protesters. And, oh, look, it's backed by George Soros. Oh, it's backed by Mark Ruffalo. Mark Ruffalo wants to sponsor black women in your community to lead your community. Damn, Mark Ruffalo. Messed up, man. Why can't you sponsor some black men to lead their community? Nah, man. Black men are they're all criminals, and some of them are voting for Trump, man. We can't sponsor that, man. Can't sponsor that. We got to sponsor the women. So Mark Ruffalo's coming into your neighborhood to give the women that you would like to date money so that they don't want to have to date you because you broke nigga. Get the fuck. You can't even make this shit up. You can't make it up. Okay. We're getting into the book now. Nuclear Rivalry and the Cold War, 1950 to 1957. We're on page 1061 of this retarded conservative shit. The oil crisis in Iran was limited in scope and duration. Neither of these can be said of the great and continuing crisis experienced by the Arabic Near East in the 20th century. The crisis of these countries was a crisis of the system itself, the collapse of Islamic civilization culminating in the disappearance of the Ottoman Empire, which ruled over it in its later stages. The Near East today is the wreckage of that civilization, and as such presents problems far greater than the simple one of inadequate natural resources. Rather, the problem is a triple one of resources, of creating a workable and viable social organization, and of developing patterns of belief, outlook, and feelings which have some constructive value for human survival. In this colossal problem, the influence of the Soviet Union or of the Western powers or even of the Cold War conflict itself are relatively minor matters, which could be reduced to much less significance if the peoples of the area could get themselves organized both externally and internally into some viable arrangements of living patterns. The same problem is being faced throughout the broad band of countries from Indonesia and Japan, across China and India, throughout Africa to Latin America, but almost nowhere is the problem more acute and apparently more hopeless than in the Near East. This arises from the area's strategic importance between Asia, Africa, and Europe, its nearness to the Soviet Union, its central position in the air routes and the water communication of the world, symbolized by the Suez Canal, and its great significance in the world's petroleum supplies. The broader aspects of the Near East problems must be reserved to a later discussion, dealing with the general problems of the buffer fringe and the underdeveloped areas. At the moment, we must concentrate on the two most acute and immediate problems in the area. These are Israel and Egypt. These two problems are working within a background of 5 significant factors. First is the continuing Soviet-American rivalry, which benefits no one in the Near East. Second is the sordid and grinding poverty of Near Eastern life, a poverty made up, in almost equal parts of poor natural resources, especially water shortages, wasteful and irrational social organizations, and hopelessly uncooperative and spiteful personality patterns. Third is the shifting but perpetual dynastic and political rivalries of the area among the Arab countries themselves. Fourth is the almost incredibly misdirected interferences from the Western powers, especially the United States. And fifth is the dominant role played by the armed forces in Near Eastern life. Of these five background factors, only the last requires any amplification here. Wherever a modern state structure appears in an impoverished environment, the possession of arms is restricted to a small group and tends to bring control of the whole society under the influence of those who possess the arms. This problem becomes particularly acute in areas where other countervailing factors, such as religion, family influence, or traditional organizations, are weak, and where the social values of the society place a high esteem on military prowess or violence. The Arabs had always been warlike. By adopting Islam in the 7th century, they acquired a religion which intensified this tendency. This was clearly shown in the Saracen conquest of the Near East, North Africa, and southwestern Europe within a century of Muhammad's death. Certain restraints, however, were placed upon this militarism by other factors, such as the religious elements in Islam and the powerful influence of family and tribal loyalties. By the 20th century, the steady dwindling of these alternative influences and finally the total disintegration of Islamic society left militarism in a much more dominant position. This situation is evident wherever Arabic influence spread, including North Africa, Spain, and Latin America, so that today the army is the chief political force all the way from the Persian Gulf to Peru. We have already seen the chief example of this in Spain. The situation is roughly the same throughout the Arabic Near East. This dominance by the armed forces would not be so objectionable were it not that the leaders are ignorant, 1, selfish, 2, 3, outstanding obstacles to any progressive reorganization of the community, especially by their diversion of limited wealth available for social or economic investment, and 4, are so lacking in military morale or competence that they provide almost no protection for the area which they are presumably supposed to defend. Certainly, any area needs some organized force of arms-bearing persons to maintain public order and to protect the area from external interference. But the incompetence of the existing armed forces from Kuwait to Bolivia is so great that a superior degree of public order and defense could have been achieved with a greater degree of stability from a simple gender army equipped with motor cars, and handguns than from the expensive arrays of complicated and misused equipment which have been forced upon the armies of this great area from the United States, the Western European powers, or, since 1955, the Communist bloc. Although parliamentary regimes, in imitation of Britain and France, had been established throughout the Near East, as in much of the world, they never functioned as democratic or even constitutional systems because of the lack of organized political parties and of any tradition of civil and personal rights. Political parties remained largely personal followings or blocs, and political power, based on the arbitrary autocracy of Semitic patriarchal family life, was also personal and never took on the impersonal characteristics associated with Western rule of law and constitutional practices. The weakness of any conception of rules and of the material benefits which help rules to survive made it impossible for the Near East to grasp the conventions associated with cooperation and opposition found in the Western two-party system, parliamentary practices, and sports. The whole range of human and universal relations of the Arabs was monistic, personal, and extra-legal, in contrast to that of the West, which is pluralistic, impersonal, and subject to rules. As a result, constitutional and two-party politics were incomprehensible to the Near East, and the parliamentary system, where it existed, was only a facade for an autocratic system of personal intrigues. It is no accident that two-party politics functioned in the Near East only briefly and in two non-Arabic, if Muslim countries, Turkey and the Sudan. It is also no accident that in most of the Near East, the chief method for changing a government was by assassination, and that such actions usually took place in the most cowardly fashion to Western eyes, such as shooting in the back. The growth of militarism in the Near East modified these political practices to some extent, but without changing them in any fundamental way. The parliament was ignored or abolished, political groups and blocs were eliminated or outlawed, often being replaced by a single amorphous and meaningless party whose sole purpose was propaganda, and military administration generally replaced civil parliamentary government. Most obviously, perhaps, changes of regime now take place by military coups instead of by rigged elections or by assassinations. Even the Sudan and Turkey had their two-party parliamentary regimes overturned by military coup d'etat in 1958 and in 1960. Elsewhere, factions within the officers' corps have replaced parliamentary political parties as the significant units of political conflict. Thus, Iraq had military coups in 1936, 1941, and 1958 and 1963. Similar events were frequent in Syria, notably in 1949, 1950, 1961, and 1962. That the poverty, chaos, and disunity of the Arab world was a consequence of organizational and morale factors rather than of such objective obstacles as limited natural resources is clear from the case of Israel. There, in less than 8,000 square miles with no significant resources and hampered by endless external obstacles, the Zionist movement has constructed the strongest, most stable, most progressive, most democratic, and most hopeful state in the Near East. Damn, I didn't know he was going to glaze them that hard on the first sentence. It's just like full glaze. Like, man. It's like I need a whole box of glazed for that one. This was possible because of the morale of the Israelis, which is based on outlooks antithetical to the attitudes of the Arabs. Oh, really? The Israeli attitudes are antithetical to that of the Arabs? I would have never guessed that. The Israelis were full of self-sacrifice, self-discipline, social solidarity, readiness to work, cooperation, and hopes for the future. Damn, he didn't even talk this good about the British. Their ideology was largely Western, with a devotion to science, democracy, individual respect, technology, and the future which could match or exceed the best periods of Western past. Damn, they're better than the entire West. Damn, bro. Like, he hasn't even said one as soon as he said Zionist, it was just like, yeah, they're the best, and they're so cool. They do everything. They're better than white people. Everything they do is a flex. That's basically what he's saying. Everything they do is a flex. Hold on. I'm just getting too deep into it. Okay. All these things made them anathema to the Arabs, whose hysterical hatred was not really aimed at the loss of Palestine as a land, but at the presence of the Israelis, whose qualities were a refutation of generations of Arab self-deception and pretenses. The precarious balance of the British had tried to keep in Palestine between their promises to the Zionists and their efforts to placate the Arabs were destroyed by Hitler's determination to annihilate the Jews of Europe and the conditions of World War II, which made it seem that he would be successful. The Jews, their supporters, and allies tried to smuggle in any Jews who could be saved from Europe. Since there was nowhere else they could go, many were smuggled into Palestine. I mean, you could have brought them to New Jersey. That would have. Can you imagine if they just brought all the Jews to New Jersey instead after World War II, and then there would be none of this whole like Israel-Palestine stuff going on? British efforts to prevent this in fulfillment of their obligations to the Arabs under the League of Nations mandate led to a kind of guerrilla warfare between the Jews and British, with the Arabs attacking the former intermittently. This problem reached acute form when the conquest of Germany opened the doors for surviving Jews to escape from the horrors of Nazism. In August 1945, President Truman asked British permission to admit 100,000 European Jews into Palestine, but his repeated requests were refused. Ignoring such permission, large-scale efforts were made to smuggle Jewish refugees into Palestine, where they could be cared for by Jewish groups. Many of these were transported under frightful conditions in overcrowded, leaky ships, which were often intercepted by the British, who took their passengers to concentration camps in Cyprus. Wait, the British? I thought it was the Germans. Wait a minute, now I'm confused. From such actions came reprisals and counter-reprisals. The Zionist element in Palestine was largely agricultural, the immigrants being settled in close-knit village communities on lands, often semi-arid lands, purchased by funds raised by the World Zionist Conference or its friends and administered under the Jewish Agency for Palestine. These organizations gave the Zionist groups over several decades the political and administrative experience and the patterns of self-sacrifice for a common cause, which provided the functioning political structure for the State of Israel as the British mandate for Palestine was ended in 1948. The Zionist communal villages, under constant danger of attack by Arab raiders, developed a mentality somewhat like that of early American frontier settlements amid hostile Indians. Each village developed a force of trained defense fighters, its Haganah, I don't know if that's Haganah or Haganah, with arms hidden in the village or in a regional center for the day in which they must fight for their continued existence. This Haganah organization subsequently became the Army of Israel. British raids on Zionist centers to arrest illegal immigrants or to seize hidden arms, and Arab attacks upon incautious Zionist settlements soon led to reprisals and counter-reprisals and to the creation of violent and bitter splinter groups within the Zionist effort. The Jewish Agency did not have absolute control over the Haganah and had decreasingly less over a number of minute reprisal groups, of which the chief were extremists Irgun Zavel Laumi, with several thousand members, or the terrorist Stern Gang of less than 200. The latter group had murdered the British High Commissioner, Lord Moyne, in November 1944, and later assassinated the United Nations mediator, Count Folke Bernadotte of Sweden, in September 1948. During the years 1945 to 1948, the Jewish Agency sought to establish a Jewish state in Palestine to remove the rigid British restrictions on Jewish immigration and Jewish land purchases, and to obtain an international loan to finance its Jewish settlement policies. These were resisted, not only because of Britain's desires to remain on amicable relations with the Arab states, but also from the obvious lack of sympathy for the Zionist cause within the British government, especially after Churchill's national government was replaced by a Labour Party regime in 1945. The immediate demand for admission of 100,000 Jewish refugees from Europe was rejected by the British, and efforts to smuggle some of these in gave rise to conditions of quasi-warfare between Britain and the Zionist groups. A league of the neighboring Arab states, which had been formed under British sponsorship in March 1945, took as its chief aim the destruction of the Zionist plans and sought to block Jewish immigration or use up Haganah arms by sneak raids on Zionist frontier settlements. When the Labour government in June 1946 refused the Zionist request for admission of the 100,000 refugees and instead sought to arrest the members of the Jewish Agency, the Irgun Zvi Leumi, in reprisal, exploded 500 pounds of TNT under the British headquarters in the East Wing of the luxurious King David Hotel in Jerusalem, killing almost 100 persons. The World Zionist Congress elections of December showed decreasing support from more moderate figures like Dr. Chaim Weizmann and David Ben-Gurion. The former won re-election as president of the World Zionist Movement by a bare majority and refused to offer his name for re-election as president of the Jewish Agency. This increase in the extremist influence within the Zionist movement made it clear to Britain that peace in Palestine could be maintained only at a great cost, which the Labour government was unable and unwilling to pay. Support for the mandate from the United States was unobtainable, since Washington generally tended to favor the Jewish side, while the British, in spite of their valiant efforts to appear impartial, clearly favored the Arabs. Death sentences on Jewish terrorists, first carried out by the British in 1947, merely intensified the violence, with the British armed forces suffering about 3 casualties a week, 1/3 fatal. In April 1947, the British sought to escape from the situation by appealing to the United Nations, which voted in November to partition Palestine into 2 intertwining Jewish and Arab zones, with an international zone in Jerusalem. The Arab League rejected partition, and its members swore to resist by force by a relentless war, according to a Cairo newspaper. This war opened with Arab riots in Palestine against the UN vote at the very time that the Jews were welcoming it. Arab irregulars began to enter Palestine from Syria and Egypt as the British began to withdraw from their long effort to administer the country. The British withdrawal from Palestine was but one aspect of the general withdrawal of Britain from its pre-war world and imperial position. It was a consequence of the general political weakening of Great Britain, its acute economic and financial position in the post-war period, and, above all, by the growing preference of the ordinary British voter for social welfare and higher living standards at home over the remote and impersonal glories of imperial prestige abroad. On September 26, 1947, the British announced that they would withdraw from Palestine, and that failure to obtain a United Nations administration or any accepted Arab Zionist partition would not delay this process. However, the British were determined not to hand over the administration to the only organization available which was capable of handling the job, the Jewish Agency, and as a result, simply abandoned or closed down many public services and destroyed or left many essential administrative records. This created a chaotic situation in which the Arab League was unable to rule, the United Nations and Britain were unwilling to rule, and the Jewish Agency was prevented from taking over by the retiring British forces. At the beginning of April 1948, small forces from Syria, Iraq, and Egypt entered Palestine to support the local Arabs' efforts to prevent the Jewish Agency from taking control of the country. They were followed by the Arab Legion of Transjordan under British officers, which came in as soon as the British mandate ended on May 14, 1948. Although the Zionists were outnumbered and had inferior equipment, their courage, tenacity, and persistence, combined with the mutual rivalries and divisions among the five Arab groups, allowed the Israeli to establish and consolidate a Zionist movement in several areas of Palestine. During the interval, financial support from American sympathizers allowed the Zionists to rectify the arms disequilibrium, chiefly by purchases from Czechoslovakia, which had just joined the Iron Curtain bloc in March. I bet you these American sympathizers are fake conservative. No, let me stop. All right. As early as January, many Arab families had begun to flee from Palestine, and by June, this became a flood. Many left voluntarily, encouraged by the unrealistic promises of the Arab League to return them as conquerors after the total defeat of Zionism. But a substantial number were uprooted and expelled by Zionist retaliatory actions. Eventually, in spite of the Jewish Agency's promise that Arabs would become welcome to continue to live in Israel if they did not act to subvert the new state, the number of refugees reached an estimated 652,000 persons. Most of these were settled in camps along the frontiers in Jordan and in Egypt and were maintained by international charity administered under the United Nations. Efforts to resettle these unfortunates within the Arab states of the Near East were blocked by these states, which refused to cooperate in any such recognition of the changed situation in Palestine, and which welcomed refugee discontent as instruments for stirring up hatred of Israel and the West among their own citizens. Large numbers of the refugees eventually left these camps and integrated themselves by their own efforts into the life of Arab states of the Near East, but birth rates in the camps were so high that the total number in the camps decreased very slowly. In Jordan, the refugees who became assimilated were so numerous and so bitter that they came to dominate that precarious state, were a constant threat to the stability of its government, forced it to destroy its friendly relations with Britain, which had founded it, and remained as an explosive threat against Israel. The new state of Israel was proclaimed by Ben-Gurion on May 14, 1948, as was recognized by President Truman 16 minutes later in the race to beat the Soviet Union, whose recognition came on May 17th. Efforts by both to use the United Nations machinery to stop the Israeli-Arab war in Palestine were frustrated by conflicting opinions and especially by British efforts to restrict Israeli acquisition of arms and immigration without placing comparable restrictions on the surrounding Arab states. A truce imposed by the UN on June 11th was violated by both sides and broke down with the resumption of fighting in July, but by that time the Arab states were squabbling bitterly among themselves and were increasingly involved in embarrassment because their propaganda, falsehoods to their own peoples about their glorious victories over Zionism could not be sustained in the face of the precipitous retreats of their forces under Israeli attacks. Some of the Arab states tried to excuse their defeats as resulting from Transjordanian treason. 10 days of renewed fighting from July 8th to 18th, 1948, mostly favorable to Israel, were ended by a 3-day UN ultimatum threatening sanctions against any state which continued fighting. This curtailment of Israeli successes by United Nations actions and by the UN mediator's suggestions that Jerusalem be given to the Arabs led directly to his assassination by Israeli extremists in September. On September 20th, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, chief Muslim religious leader of the Levant, and a wartime collaborator with the Nazis, proclaimed an Arab government of all Palestine, which was at once recognized by all the Arab states except Jordan, and was set up at Gaza on Palestine territory occupied by Egypt. Israel, in return, launched a successful and successive week-long attacks on Egypt and Lebanon, which were stopped by UN truces on October 31st, 1948. Belated recognition of the truth about Egypt's weaknesses, if not its corruption, led to street riots in Cairo and assassination of the Egyptian prime minister. British efforts to invoke its 1936 alliance with Egypt to justify British military action against Israel were blocked by Egypt's refusal to allow such public display of Egypt's helplessness. 5 British planes which attacked Israel were promptly shot down January 7, 1949. This led to Britain's de facto recognition of Israel on January 29th and the gradual release of Jewish immigrants imprisoned on Cyprus. A series of armistice agreements were negotiated in the spring of 1949. These left various forces in approximately the position they held, but were accompanied by explicit refusals by the Arab states to make peace with Israel, to recognize its existence, or to allow any steps to be taken to remedy the plight of Arab refugees outside Palestine. To this day, these problems remain, with the Arab states still at war with Israel and publicly sworn to exterminate it. Egypt's defeat in the Israeli war brought to a head persistent Egyptian discontent, especially its hatred for the corrupt and lecherous King Farouk. Egypt's plight, however, was far deeper than more ancient than Israel, and Farouk's blame, in spite of his total failure as ruler, was less than that of his great-great-grandfather Muhammad Ali, who had been Khedive of Egypt under the Ottoman Sultan in 1811 to 1848. Until Muhammad Ali's time, Egypt continued its ancient practice of raising a single crop of food from each annual flooding of the Nile Valley. Muhammad Ali, in order to finance his plans to conquer the whole Near East, took over state ownership of all the land and built a great network of irrigation canals which permitted perennial cultivation of the land with 2 to 4 crops a year. He also established state monopolies of industrial enterprises to equip his armed forces. Muhammad Ali's successors, especially his grandson Ismail, ended state ownership of land and industry, allowing both to fall into private hands where they retained much of their monopolistic character. At the same time, they burdened the country with enormous debts to European bankers for public works projects of irrigation, railroads, and the Suez Canal. In the same period, the demand for Egyptian long-lint cotton became so great during the world cotton shortage caused by the American Civil War that it became the favorite crop of the landlord class and the chief source of foreign exchange to pay off Egypt's debts. But this meant that Egypt's prosperity became linked to the uncontrolled fluctuation of prices on the Liverpool cotton market. The result of all this were to create the Egypt of 1936, the first year of Farouk's reign. Irrigation, with its perpetual motion farming, greatly increased the output of food and allowed an increase in population from 3.2 million in 1821 to 6.8 million in 1892 to 12.5 million in 1914. At the same time, European science, by its control of epidemic diseases, reduced the infant mortality rate. The rise in population began to outstrip the increase in food supply by a wide margin, especially when the small group of landowners insisted that the land be used for exported cotton rather than for home consumed food. In 1914, production of cereals was 3.5 million tons for 12.5 million Egyptians. By 1940, there was only 4 million tons for 17 million persons. The output of food continued to crawl upward following the great leaps in population. By 1960, the population was increasing at the rate of one person a minute, over 500,000 a year, and had already passed 26 million. Moreover, as a result of perennial irrigation, the population of 1940 was much less healthy than that of in 1840, since it was infected with debilitating chronic waterborne infectious diseases like malaria, bilharzia, I don't even know what that is, ankylostomyces, and irritating eye infections. Moreover, unlike the ancient cultivation based on annual flooding, which replaced the fertility of the soil, the perennial irrigation of today requires artificial fertilizers, which the harassed peasants cannot afford, to retain the productivity of the soil. Thus, by 1950, an enormously increased population, worn down by anemia and malnutrition, was crowded in a narrow valley under the greatest population density in the world, with neither land nor work for idle millions, their miserable fates entirely in the hands of a small, ruling elite of landlords, commercial monopolists, and political exploiters of the world economic changes. Until 1952, monopolization of land, although less complete than in other Near Eastern countries, was nevertheless extreme, since 3% of the landowners held 55% of the agricultural land and 28% of the landowners held 87% of the land. The remaining 72% of landowners with 13% of the land were too poor to exploit their plots effectively, since they could not afford fertilizer, choice seed, or adequate tools, and in most cases had to supplement their work on the land by other activities or by renting plots from other owners. Since the great owners did not work their lands themselves, most Egyptian soil was worked by renters and sharecroppers, often removed from the real owner by a series of intermediaries and subleasers. In addition, of course, millions without land of their own had to work for about 5 American cents an hour on the lands of others, and a third group eked out an existence entirely from rented lands in which the rents were equal to about 3/4 of the net yield. The burden of population on the land, about 1,500 persons per square mile, compared to about 200 in France, left everyone drastically underemployed, with at least half the rural population merely sitting around in the dust or napping all day. Because children were more healthy than their disease-sapped parents, They were more energetic and were often skillful and could be obtained for wages less than half that of men. About 20 American cents for a day, or 10 or 12 of 10 or 12 hours in 1956. Much of the agricultural work, especially in cotton, was done by children. The pressure of population, the productivity of the land from multiple cropping, average annual yields about twice those in Europe, and monopolized land ownership drove land prices and rents upward just as they drove wages downward. This gave rise to a steady increase of renting and sharecropping before 1952. By 1948, the cash rental of land per acre was about 30% higher than the average net income per acre. Thus, the situation in the rural economy was explosive. These problems reached this critical level under the shield of artificial prosperity of Egypt during the war. As the chief base for the Allied war effort in the Near East and the center, the British resistance to Rommel's Afrika Korps, Allied supplies and money had poured into Egypt and provided wages and higher standard of living for all. Moreover, high wartime prices for cotton had created a temporary boom. By 1947, all this collapsed, and hundreds of thousands who had been supported by British spending during the war were wandering the alleys of Cairo without money, work, or hope. In sharp contrast with the poverty of millions, about 400 families had made immense fortunes from the land since 1950. In 1952, when 250 acres brought its owner an income of about $20,000 a year, the royal family had close to 200,000 acres, and a few hundred landlord families held over 1,000,000 acres. Little of these incomes was devoted to any constructive purpose, although few of their possessors lived such dissolute and wasteful existences as Farouk. These economic discontents were capped by political unrest. Egypt had been granted its independence by Great Britain in 1922, but the latter continued to interfere in the governing of the country by peremptory notes or even ultimatums, as in 1924 and 1938. Submission by the monarchy or the government to such pressure roused great animosity in the assembly, which was generally dominated by the irresponsible Nationalist Party, the Wafd, led successively by Saad Zaghloul and Mustafa Nas. Relations with Britain were finally regulated by a treaty in 1936, which established a 20-year alliance, granted Britain continued possession of the naval base at Alexandria until 1944, and allowed it to keep a force of 10,000 men in the Canal Zone. Other British forces were withdrawn, and the disputed question of conflicting British and Egyptian rights in the Sudan were compromised to allow limited Egyptian migration and limited use of Egyptian troops in that area. The most significant result of the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty of 1936 was a double one. By providing withdrawal for British troops from Egypt proper, it made it necessary for Egypt to establish its own army. At the same time, it established two political issues: British troops in the Suez Canal Zone and incomplete Egyptian control of the Sudan, on which that new army could agitate. Most significant of all, Mustafa Nasr's decree of 1936 establishing the military academy to train officers for the new army opened this career to any Egyptian, independent of class or economic status. This created the opening by which ambitious and relatively poor young men could work their way upward in power and wealth. It was the first essential step towards the Nasser government of the 1960s, and for the first time in thousands of years made it possible for Egypt to be ruled by Egyptians. The Muhammad Ali dynasty of 1811 to 1952 was of Albanian origin. The first class of military academy to graduate after the Treaty of 1936 was the class of 1938, whose members, led by Nasser, made the revolution of 1952. Most of the leaders of that revolt were either sons or grandsons of poor peasants. The chief aims of their revolt were agrarian reform, elimination of waste, inefficiency, and corruption from the Egyptian government, and the completion of independence by the withdrawal of British influence from the Canal Zone and, if possible, the Sudan. The revolt moved forward under the impetus of increasing shame and hatred for the Farouk monarchy. In this process, two chief steps were the British ultimatum of 1942 and the defeat by Israel in 1948, since these opened an unbridgeable gap between the dynasty and the officers' group. The conspiracies of the class of 1938 began almost immediately upon their graduation from the military academy, when Gamal Abdel Nasser joined a group which exchanged secret oaths to reform Egypt by expelling the British. By 1939, most of this group were in contact with the Muslim Brotherhood, a secret band of fanatics founded in 1929 to establish, by assassination and violence if necessary, a political regime founded on purely Muslim principles. Many of both groups were involved in anti-British and pro-Nazi agitations throughout the Near East of 1938 to 1942. These centered around the fanatical Mufti of Jerusalem and culminated in the pro-Nazi revolt of Rashid Ali al-Kilani in Iraq. I lost where I was at. During Hitler's conquest of Crete in April 1941, Britain used force to overthrow the new pro-Hitler government in Iraq, but the anti-British agitations continued throughout the Arab world. When they became acute in Egypt in February 1942, the British ambassador, accompanied by British tanks, visited King Farouk in the Abdeen Palace and gave him a choice between cooperation with Britain or deposition. The king yielded at once, but many of the younger officers were outraged at this affront to Egyptian dignity, and Lieutenant Colonel Mohammed Naguib resigned his commission in protest at an army which was unable to protect its king. 10 years later, when Farouk's disgraceful behavior had alienated most of the army and disquieted much of the world, this same Naguib By then, a heroic general who had been wounded 3 times in the War of 1948 with Israel, was the nominal head of the revolt. This revolt was engineered by a small group of 5 officers whose real leader was Nasir, although the latter, who had been conspiring against one thing or another since his school days, was virtually unknown to the police until the revolt had already started. Like most revolts, that of 1952 started from an event which had little to do with the conspirators' plans. In October 1951, Mustafa Nahas, who had signed the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty of 1936, enacted a law to abrogate it. Shortly afterwards, guerrilla attacks on the British military installations in the Canal Zone drove the British forces to seek to disarm the Egyptian police nearby. In the resulting fight, about 50 Egyptians were killed and 100 wounded. Excuse me. The next day, January 26, 1952, riots in Cairo burned down about 400 buildings, including the famous Shepherd's Hotel, the center of British tourist life in Egypt. Damage ran over $60 million, but the real destruction was the Egyptian political system. Police and army both refused to fire upon the incendiaries of January 26th. Farouk, who had no wish to alienate the British, dismissed Prime Minister Nahas for the cabinet's inadequate efforts to suppress the disturbances. But no successor could be found capable of winning the confidence of the diverse groups who sought to exploit the miseries of Egypt. On the night of July 22nd, 8 young officers seized control of the army headquarters, the radio stations, and the government, and forced Farouk to make General Naguib head of the army. Only 2 soldiers were killed in the process. 4 days later, with tanks surrounding the palace, Farouk was forced to abdicate and was sent into exile. The new revolution had neither doctrine nor program and continued to improvise year after year. A civilian prime minister was replaced by General Naguib on September 7th, and he was replaced by Nasser on February 25th, 1954. Most decrees, with the exception of the Agrarian Law of 1952 and its subsequent revisions, were concerned with the officers' junta's efforts to consolidate itself in power. Opposition groups from all parts of the political spectrum were arrested, usually imprisoned without trial, and sometimes tortured. Some were tried and executed. All political parties were dissolved and their assets confiscated for the people. A rather vague pro-junta party called the National Liberation Rally was established to support the new regime, but without any real program. The Communists, the Muslim Brotherhood, and striking labor unions were persecuted, and most of the wealthy elite were cut down in wealth and influence. The sources of these authoritarian moves were Nasser, even in the period when Naguib was both President of the Republic, June 1953 to November 1954, and Prime Minister, September 1952 to February 1954. Nasser, who replaced Naguib as Prime Minister in February 1954, replaced him as President as well in November that year. The general issue on which they broke was Nasser's autocracy, but the specific issue was his outlawing of the Muslim Brotherhood. Nasser won out in the struggle because he was concerned only with the reality of power and was prepared to cooperate with any group, to adopt any program, or to sacrifice any friend if doing so would strengthen his control of Egypt. Originally, his personal sympathies were with the peasant masses and with the West, and there is no evidence that he was possessed of the pleasure-loving, indolent characteristics which weaken so many ambitious Arabs. He continued to regard himself as a man of the people, but his insatiable thirst was for personal power. All right, let me see how much is left in this chapter. Yeah, there's still like another 10 pages in that chapter, so I'm just going to stop here for now. Now, we can kind of see in this chapter where the whole Egypt and Israel thing started. Well, obviously it started way before this, but in the post-World War II period, we can see the beginning development of Israel, the greatest country on earth, according to Carol Quigley. They have no flaws, basically. No character flaws, no cultural flaws. It was the best country, even better than Britain, better than Germany, better than France, better than Spain, better than the United States. They are the best country on earth, hands down, no questions asked. And then, those pesky Egyptians, trying to grow their food by the river, annoying. So annoying, right? But yeah, we can kind of see the development of their region and what's going on there. Kind of interesting stuff, but I kind of knew a little bit about that, about the wars. They had a lot of wars right after World War II to establish their positions. So you can check out the PDF for this in the description if you like. So thanks for watching if you did. If you didn't, you won't hear this part anyway. Have a good day and peace.